I will spend a couple of minutes introducing our panel members, and then each one will get roughly 10 minutes or so to present their thesis and talk about their topics. And then after they each get to present their topics, I'm going to invite them to question themselves on their topics and challenge their assertions in their papers. And after that's done, hopefully there'll be some time for audience questions on this important topic. The one question that I have on voter identification is, well, there's many questions, but the one main question that I have is this issue a red herring, or is this actually a legitimate issue that deserves our attention? Obviously, some of the papers talk about some of these points. We know it's a highly politicized issue, and it's one of those issues that really fall very neatly into a left and right Democrat-Republican, right? We all know from reading newspapers over these past number of years that voter ID laws are very much topical. They're very much fraught with all sorts of analysis and data on both sides of the equation. We know that right Republicans tend to feel that voter ID laws are important to protect the sanctity of the election process, and that states have at least a strong interest in protecting that. And we also know that typically the left side or the Democrat side believes that that's not true, that incidence of voter fraud is so small that these can only be justified as efforts to disenfranchise mostly urban and elderly voters. So it should be a fascinating next hour. I'm very much looking forward to it. With that said, let me quickly introduce our panelists. On my far left, your far right, is Hans von Spakovsky. Mr. Spakovsky is currently the manager of the Heritage Foundation Election Law Reform Institute and a senior legal fellow at the Mies Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He is a graduate of Vanderbilt University, which is right here in Nashville, Tennessee, isn't it, Mr. Williamson? He writes about a number of relevant voting rights issues, such as voter fraud and voter identification laws. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, he served as commissioner on the Federal Election Committee, and he's previously worked at the Justice Department providing expertise in enforcing voting rights acts and such. So he is certainly going to be interesting to hear from. In the middle of our panel is Professor Tracey Carter. Professor Carter is an associate professor and director of academic success at Belmont University College of Law, also in Nashville, Tennessee. She received a Master's Public Administration degree and her Doctorate of Education degree from Tennessee State University and her law degree from Tennessee College of Law. Before becoming a law professor, Dr. Carter was director of the Tennessee State University's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Compliance. She also served as Chief Diversity Officer and Affirmative Action Officer for the Tennessee Board of Regents. On my immediate right is Professor Eugene Mazo. He is a visiting associate professor of law at Rutgers University. He is a graduate of Columbia College, not in Tennessee, and holds a master's degree from Harvard University, a doctorate degree from Oxford University, and a law degree from Stanford. Professor Mazo is a specialist in the law of democracy, and he writes about American election law, legislation, the regulation of political process. So I think it's going to be a fascinating hour. So, Mr. von Spakovsky, if you would like to set things off for us, that'd be great.
Sure, I will. But before I start, first of all, I want to thank the Law Review and everyone for inviting me to Memphis. I did go to the other law school, trade school, I should say, in Nashville. How many folks in the audience are law students? Okay, well, before we get going, I did want to tell you that I work at the Heritage Foundation, and we have a great internship program. So if you're looking for one, I suggest you take a look at the site. We have three big advantages. First off, unlike a lot of Washington internships, particularly if you work for congressional offices, we actually pay you. Second, we'll do real work. We don't use our interns to make photocopies and get copies. They do real research and writing. And third, very important in Washington, which is one of the most expensive metropolitan areas you can go to, we actually provide housing for our interns. So if you are interested, please take a look at it. And it's not just a summer program. We have a spring, summer, and fall program. And you might end up in the legal center where I work, but you could end up in our foreign policy shop, in our domestic policy shop. We cover a lot of different areas. In the summers, we have upwards of 80 interns. So I'd recommend folks take a look at that. Look, one of the key principles of a fair election is assuring that the person who casts a ballot is legally eligible to vote. The best way and fairest way to do that is to require individuals to authenticate their citizenship when they register and to show an ID when they vote. Voter ID does not equal voter suppression. Voter IDs are not the only solution. There are a lot of other steps that need to be taken to make sure you have a secure election process. And in addition to stopping impersonation fraud, and we have cases like that in our Heritage voter fraud database, which I'll tell you about in just a second. It can also stop voting under fictitious voter registrations, fictitious as to names and residential addresses. We have cases like that in our database. It can also potentially stop illegal aliens from voting, and it sometimes can stop double voting by people who are registered in more than one state, and I can give you examples of that. Now, I'm often accused of saying we have massive voter fraud in the United States. I have never said that. It tells you how bad reporters are at taking notes that they keep saying that. But what I have said is we have enough fraud that we should be concerned about it. And the best summary of this, I think, is from a 2008 United States Supreme Court case. Indiana passed one of the first photo ID law requirements in the country. It was challenged. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the law as being constitutional, saying it was not a burden on voters. The opinion was not written by one of those dreaded conservatives on the court. No, it was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, who's now retired and is a well-known liberal stalwart of the court. And what he said was, because he wrote the majority opinion, was examples of such fraud have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists, and not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but it could affect the outcome of a close election. And that's the key. You can look in any state in this country and you will see close elections all the time. Now, if you have any doubts about that, do a quick Google search. You'll see that the mayor, small-town mayor of a city in Alabama, I think it was Gordon, just got removed from office for engaging in felonies of voter fraud to ensure that he got reelected in an election that was decided by a little more than a dozen votes. Or just take a quick look at what happened in North Carolina just recently, the 9th Congressional District, a race decided by about 900 votes. The race has been overturned, a new election has been ordered, and a gentleman there who was engaging in manipulating, stealing, forging absentee ballots has already been indicted on several felonies for his work in that case. Now, we started a database at the Heritage Foundation a couple of years ago. It's not a comprehensive database. It's just a sampling of voter fraud cases from across the country. We're up to 1,200 cases. These are cases where someone's been actually convicted in a court of law of committing fraud, or a court has ordered a new election, or a state board of elections has ordered a new election, like in North Carolina. Polls show overwhelming support for voter ID. And that has stayed consistent for the past decade. And that overwhelming support runs across all racial and ethnic lines and all party affiliation lines. A majority of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, a majority of Black Americans, Hispanics, Asians, white Americans all believe voter ID is a common sense requirement. No doubt that's because they know they have to use a photo ID to get a library card, drink a beer, cash a check, board an airplane, check into a hotel, which I had to do. Or if you're poor, apply for government benefits in a lot of states like Medicaid or food stamps. Organizations that protest this are obviously not in touch with their constituents. Now, let me quickly go through. So I don't want to bore you with statistics and data, but I'm an undergraduate of MIT, and I was really taught there that you should look at the data before you make a conclusion. Despite what you've heard, voter ID does not suppress votes. It does not keep down turnout, and it does not keep people out of the polls. In 2000, a University of Delaware and University of Nebraska study looked at the 2002, 2004, 2006 elections and found that voter ID does not affect turnout, including across racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. The report concluded this, quote, "Concerns about voter ID laws affecting turnout are much ado about nothing." American University, which is not exactly a bastion of conservatism, did a similar study, found the same thing. The University of Missouri did a study of what happened in Indiana after their voter ID law went in place. They actually found that in the 2006 election, which was the first time the ID law was in place, turnout increased by 2 percentage points. There was no evidence that counties with a higher percentage of minority, poor, elderly, or less educated populations suffered any reduction in turnout. The Heritage Foundation, where I work, did a study in 2007, showed the same thing, and just a month ago, the latest study came out on this. It's by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They looked at voter registration and turnout data from across the nation, all 50 states, from 2008 through 2016. So 8 years worth of data. And their conclusion was this: no negative effect on registration and turnout overall or for any specific group defined by race, gender, or party affiliation. We've now got 10 years worth of data from states like Georgia and Indiana, both of which put in a photo ID requirement, showing no effect on turnout. In fact, turnout went up in those states. Indiana, remember their case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, in 2008, when their photo ID law was in place for the first time in a presidential election, anybody remember who won the state of Indiana in 2008? Barack Obama, first Democrat to win the state since the early 1960s. Both of those laws were upheld in the federal courts, and in fact, the judges in both the Georgia and Indiana case made a point of saying that the plaintiffs who had challenged it, including the ACLU and other organizations, had made all these claims that there were hundreds of thousands of people who would be unable to vote because of the ID. They couldn't produce a single individual who would be unable to vote because of the ID. In fact, in the Indiana case, I just want to read you a quick quote. Despite apocalyptic assertions of wholesale voter disenfranchisement, plaintiffs have produced not a single piece of evidence of any identifiable registered voter who would be prevented from voting pursuant to the 2006 photo ID law because of his or her inability to obtain the necessary voter identification. We've got 10 years worth of data, and it shows it doesn't keep people out of the polls. Two things you all should keep in mind. Every state that's passed an ID law provides a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. And in fact, some states, Tennessee included, which you all know, you have an ID law, Tennessee actually has an exemption that says that if you're indigent and unable to get a free ID due to the cost of underlying documents such as a birth certificate, you still get to vote. Now, I'll end this because I think I'm probably over my time. Okay. Voter ID laws, again, despite what you think, have been upheld in court cases in Indiana, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Arizona, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And again, people aren't having any problems voting there. Now, the one argument I hear about this, by the way, is that whenever I talk about the fact that, you need an ID I had to show my ID to fly down here to Memphis, and I talk about things like that, people say, well, that's not a constitutional right, buying a beer either. Well, the civil rights movement wasn't just about voting rights. The civil rights movement was also about the ability to travel freely in the United States without restriction on public transportation, on trains and other things were owned by private companies, and yet I have to show an ID to board an airplane. And when I take Amtrak from Washington, D.C. to New York, I have to, this big sign says I have to be prepared to show my ID. A second constitutional right that I better have a government ID if I want to exercise is my Second Amendment rights. If I want to go into a gun shop and buy a gun, I'm not going to be able to do it without a Second Amendment. The right to employment, the right to work and support yourself and your family, that is just as fundamental a right as the right to vote. Well, there's a federal law, I don't know if you all realize this, those of you who have been in jobs for quite a while may not realize that all the students in here are going to have to go find a job soon, should realize this. When you want to get a new job, you're going to have to prove your identity and either your citizenship or your legal status as a non-citizen through providing various documents that the federal government requires through federal law. We decided in this country quite rightly a long time ago in a very famous case called Loving versus Virginia, Loving versus Virginia was a case in the 1960s in which the U.S. Supreme Court threw out a ban in Virginia on interracial marriage, that marriage is a fundamental constitutional right. Well, I happened to check the website of Shelby County before I came down here this morning, and guess what you need in this county if you want to exercise your fundamental civil right to get married and get a marriage license? It says, quote, a picture ID is required. Finally, all of us know about the First Amendment right to free speech, and the ability to practice our religions without interference by the government. But something else that people, I think, often forget that is in the First Amendment is the right to, quote, petition the government for redress of grievances. If I want to get into the U.S. Justice Department and go talk to them try to get a meeting with the Attorney General or someone else to redress a grievance I have about the government, I can tell you, because I used to work there, that if you want to get into that government building or most other government buildings in Washington, D.C., you better have a government-issued photo ID with you because you're not going to get in without it. States are simply implementing a similar requirement when it comes to voting, and it is not an attempt to suppress votes. We are the only Western democracy that does not consistently require an ID to vote. Even Mexico, our southern neighbor, which has a population poverty much larger than ours, in the 1970s put in a photo ID requirement. And a lot of folks in Mexico credit that with having reduced considerably the corruption in the political election system that occurred down there. I actually got in trouble about a couple of years ago because I posted a picture, I think on my Twitter feed. I found a picture of Nelson Mandela, who, when he first ran for president of South Africa, there's a picture of him, you can find it, with a T-shirt telling people to go get an ID so they could vote. Why? Because South Africa has a much stricter photo ID law than in states in the United States for voting.
I think we're about...
Right? Okay. I will end with a quote. In 2005, you all may remember, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker formed a commission that looked at election reform across the United States. They issued a final report, which you can easily pull up. And here was one of the quotes from that paper. The electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters. Photo IDs currently are needed to board a plane, enter federal buildings, and cash a check. Voting is equally important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Professor Carter, if you just indulge me for just 1 minute. What strikes me from your presentation is very interesting, but of all those examples you gave, such as traveling, buying a gun, getting into Department of Justice, the state interest is much different. State interest there is heightened security interests, which don't really play into voter ID. So is it really apples to apples when you're drawing those comparisons?
Every time there is enough fraud to change the outcome of an election, like there was in North Carolina, I think that is a deep security interest of the United States. Because without a secure system, that's fundamental to democracy.
So you're suggesting that the state has as strong an interest in allowing someone to buy a gun or get on an airplane as they do in allowing them to vote. Similar interest.
I think voting is a fundamentally important interest of a democracy.
Thank you. Professor Carter?
Good morning. I would also like to thank the symposium staff and the entire University of Memphis Law Review for asking me to be on this panel as well as to publish in their upcoming symposium edition. And so I'm giving you a snapshot, as has already been mentioned in the introductions. We can't tell you everything that we have in our Law Review articles, but I'm trying to give you at least a picture of what you will see once the article is published. And so mine is called Eliminating Barriers to Voting: How Allowing College Students to Use Their Student IDs to Vote in Certain Southeastern States Can Help Make Voting Great in America. So, voter ID laws in certain southeastern states as they relate to college students' ability to use their college student IDs for voting purposes during the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections and during the recent November 2018 midterm elections are the focus of my presentation this morning. The American Association of Geographers defines southeastern states contiguous to Tennessee as Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Virginia. So I'll be discussing college student IDs as voter ID in these 7 states, with a special emphasis on Tennessee's voter ID law since, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm at Belmont University College of Law, but also the CLE is here in Tennessee. So, and I've been looking at Tennessee's voter ID law since it went into effect in 2012. It was actually passed in 2011, but it actually went in effect in 2012. The major arguments for and against permitting college student IDs to be used for identification for voting purposes at the polls on Election Day will also be discussed, including comments made by legislatures and a few of the aforementioned states on the arguments for and against allowing such IDs. So students are encouraged to be leaders and engaged citizens in our democratic society. One key way that they do so is by being involved in the electoral process, voting. It is well known that college students can play a critical role in elections, and they are often seen as a substantial voting constituency, especially during presidential elections. In fact, presidential debates are traditionally held on college campuses, and this is not an accidental occurrence. Here's a picture from the University of Mississippi in 2008. And also, we have the honor of hosting a presidential debate at Belmont University in 2008. Chief Justice Earl Warren, in a United States Supreme Court decision, Reynolds versus Sims, stated the following in 1964. The right to vote freely for the candidate of one's choice is of the essence of a democratic society, and any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government. However, some southeastern states have voter ID laws that make it easier for students to use their college IDs to vote in their particular state, whereas some other southeastern states have voter ID laws that make it difficult or virtually impossible for college students to use their student IDs for voting purposes. Although some southeastern states accept college student IDs as acceptable forms of identification on Election Day, certain other southeastern states do not. So what are some of the key constitutional provisions related to college students' right to vote? The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment helps protect college students' voting rights and grants college students who are citizens of the United States the right to vote. Specifically, the 14th Amendment states in relevant part the following: no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 26th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is also another key amendment applicable to a college student's right to vote, and explicitly states the following: the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. The United States Senate also made a statement on college students' right to vote. Back in 1971, the U.S. Senate discussed college students' voting rights and stated the following in reference to the 26th Amendment: forcing young voters to undertake special burdens obtaining absentee ballots or traveling to one centralized location in each city, for example, in order to exercise the right to vote, may well serve to dissuade them from participating in the election. This result in the election procedures that created, or at least inconsistent with the purpose of the Voting Rights Act, which sought to encourage greater political participation on the part of the young. Such segregation might even amount to a denial of their 14th Amendment right to equal protection of the laws in the exercise of the franchise. The U.S. Supreme Court, in its landmark decision in Sim versus United States, upheld college students' voting rights and affirmed that students have the constitutional right to register and vote in the towns and cities where they go to college. In addition, Nemi, Hammer, and Jackson in the Election Law Journal entitled their article, "Where Can College Students Vote? A Legal and Empirical Perspective," in 2009 state, "A bedrock principle is that states cannot make it more difficult for students than for other voters, or ask them questions that they would not ask others who are similarly situated." And they were citing to the United States Supreme Court decision in Sim. One of the cases that my colleague just spoke about in Indiana, the United States Supreme Court Crawford versus Marion County Election Board decision, was issued in 2008. And they have, the United States Supreme Court has upheld certain voting restrictions, as he mentioned, imposed by states, which has seriously impacted college students' voting rights. Specifically, enactment of Indiana's strict photo ID law, as upheld in the Crawford case, was considered, quote, one of the most restrictive photo identification requirements in the country, because its voter ID statute requires Indiana residents to show a government-issued photo ID before voting at the polls on Election Day, which hampers college students trying to vote in the state who do not possess such a photo ID. So what have the opponents and the proponents said about strict photo ID laws? And this is from both the Crawford decision, the United States Supreme Court decision, what the plurality stated, as well as what the dissenters stated. So I'm going to give you arguments on both sides. So the plurality held, and this is what proponents of strict photo ID laws state, is that election modernization, prevention and detection of in-person voter fraud, and safeguarding voter confidence in the integrity of the electoral process are justifiable state interests for the enactment of the state's strict photo ID law. But then the dissenters in that U.S. Supreme Court decision, as well as opponents of strict photo ID laws, have argued the following: that such laws impose serious and great burdens on the right to vote for a significant percentage of voters. Number two, they deter voting by eligible voters. And number three, there is a lack of evidence of in-person voter impersonation fraud at the polls. In fact, Justice Souter in her dissent stated, without a shred of evidence that in-person voter impersonation is a problem in the state, Indiana has adopted one of the most restrictive photo identification requirements in the country, end quote. So college students registering and voting in their college communities. The United States Census Bureau counts college students as residents of their college towns. Federal funds are dispersed to local municipalities based upon statistics that include college students. College students are a valuable resource to their college communities by serving as volunteers, creating jobs in the local community, providing an economic boost to the community, and paying taxes, such as gasoline and sales taxes. Other reasons that have been cited for allowing college students to register and vote in their college town include the fact that college students have a vested interest in the local issues that have an effect on their quality of life, including how the community deals with off-campus housing and zoning restrictions, the environment, taxes, transportation, and personal safety. In addition, allowing students to vote where they attend college alleviates the inconvenience that students have to obtaining and returning an absentee ballot. This came for the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. But I do put a caveat and put a kickstand right here, put an important note for college students. So if a college student has a state-funded scholarship or a privately funded scholarship that is designated for a local student, the student should, quote, be sure to check the terms of his or her scholarship before registering in his or her local college community, because the student could potentially lose their scholarship. So if the scholarship specifically says this has to be for a local resident, then a college student does need to double check that. But outside of that, that's the only caveat. So let me give you a quick summary. So some students are more connected and more informed about their hometown candidates and issues, so they prefer to register and vote in their hometowns. Other students prefer to register at their school to vote on local candidates and issues affecting their college or university. Therefore, any college student who considers their college community as their primary residence is permitted to vote where they attend college. So in sum, college students have the constitutional right to register and vote in the place that they consider to be, quote, their home, and this can be their parents' house, their apartment, or their dorm room, or a college campus. Thus, based upon the United States Constitution and U.S. Supreme Court precedent, college students should not have to navigate the logistics of a burdensome voting process, including dealing with certain southeastern states' voter ID laws that refuse to allow them to use their student IDs in order to exercise their right to vote. So I'm going to show you a quick comparison of the voter IDs in the 7 states that I have picked out, including Tennessee. Some southeastern states' voter ID laws are more what I call college student friendly than other southeastern states. In fact, certain state voter ID laws, such as Tennessee, explicitly rejects college student IDs from being used for voting purposes. And this is the Tennessee statute, Tennessee Code 27112C2B, explicitly states, quote, an identification card issued to a student by an institution of higher education containing a photograph of a student shall not be evidence of identification for purposes of verifying the person's identification on the application for ballot. In other states, such as Georgia, students attending public colleges can use their student IDs for voting purposes. However, if you're a student attending a private college in Georgia, you are not allowed to use your student ID. And so on the next slide, I have basically a comparative analysis of what states allowed in the 2012 presidential election, the 2016 presidential election, and the recent 2018 midterm election, including Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Virginia. And I have categorized states as college student friendly based solely upon whether any form of college student ID was allowed to be used for voting purposes in any of these elections. So, as you can see, going across, Alabama, they had a voter ID law in effect during the 2012 presidential election, and theirs was college student friendly. 2016, same thing. 2018, same thing. Georgia, see the green checks all the way across. Kentucky, checks all the way across. Mississippi's voter ID law was enacted but was not actually in effect in 2012. It required pre-clearance, which is basically where the federal government had to approve any voting changes that you made in some of the South states that had a history of voting irregularities or having problems with voting. But then, as enacted though, even though it was not in effect, theirs was college student friendly. They actually allowed student IDs, was put into their actual law. Then we get down to North Carolina. North Carolina was not applicable. They did not have a voter ID law in effect in 2012. Their voter ID law, as enacted, was not in effect at the time of the 2016 presidential election, because the Fourth Circuit ruled the law unconstitutional in July 2016. The Fourth Circuit had gone through, and I don't have enough time to tell you all the different issues that they found, but they did specifically find that there was some discriminatory intent, and they could point to different things that had been done, that the legislatures had done, such as calling to see or looking at different people who were voting. And once they determined that there was a lot of minority voters that were doing certain things, then they changed their law. And so as enacted, it was not in effect, but North Carolina does not have a college student-friendly voter ID law in the 2016 election and in the 2018 midterm election. But you see I have an asterisk. North Carolina voters in November 2018 passed a constitutional amendment mandating voters present approved photo IDs. Photo IDs permitted at the polls on election day in the state now include student IDs from community colleges as well as public and private institutions. Tennessee, we have a no going all the way across. Virginia, green check. So, what have Tennessee opponents and what have Tennessee proponents said about allowing student IDs as voter ID in our particular state? So in opposing the use of student IDs, but permitting student university-issued photo IDs for voting at the polls for college faculty, so if you're a college faculty member, you can use your ID to go to the polls to vote. The senator who was a Tennessee voter ID bill sponsor said that the difference is because, quote, student IDs are frequently forged so students can lie about their age. But, to show you on the flip side, this same senator in 2013 introduced a bill that would have permitted, he changed his mind. He introduced a bill that would have permitted college students' IDs issued by state colleges and universities to be used to vote at the polls. But the bill failed. And there have been other bills that have failed. It's been brought up year after year. There have been lawsuits that have actually been filed in Tennessee, but Tennessee keeps saying no. So another Tennessee senator expressed concern about just how valid a college ID would be, saying it doesn't have proper security markings and that it puts pressure on election workers to, quote, identify all types of college IDs and determine their validity. And then we had spokesman for Tennessee Secretary of State in response to Tennessee college students' protest over voter ID laws, stated that Tennessee's voter ID law was, quote, designed to prevent voter fraud while ensuring all registered Tennesseans exercise their right to vote. But then in contrast, we have a Nashville, Tennessee representative who stated that he, quote, was particularly concerned about the fact that a number of students who come to Tennessee from other states are unable to use their state-issued IDs to participate in elections. They pay for tuition here, some of them pay rent here, and surely they contribute to our society here. And yet we say that we don't acknowledge the fact that they are who they say they are based upon their other state's identification. To me, that's just wrong. And then we had a Fisk University student and an activist who stated that he was not able to vote in the November 2016 presidential election, quote, because he didn't have one of the acceptable IDs. He noted the same is true for many other Nashville students who are from out of state. This student inquired, we are making it easier in Tennessee to get a gun, but yet harder to vote. Sure. Thank you. And so, what has happened in the other states as well? I have about 2 minutes and I have about 2 more slides, so I think I'm gonna be able to make it. So, in Georgia, the argument has been made that there's a due to the lack of uniformity between student IDs, and there's a likelihood that it will put a burden on poll workers. But then in contrast, a student who goes to Morehouse, who uses their IDs to buy food, school, supplies, use computer labs, and get books from the library. But they can't use their student IDs because they go to a private college. And so we're saying because you go to a private school, or Georgia's saying because you go to a private school, you can't use your ID. But if you go down the street to Georgia State or to the University of Georgia, you can use your student ID to vote. Then Mississippi Secretary of State, he encourages Mississippi students to actually vote. And they actually put in their in their voter ID law several years ago, allowing students to vote. And then proponents in North Carolina argue that student IDs are trustworthy. Universities likely have more contact with ID holders than election boards have with registered voters. And then the opponents had said that they opposed it because college IDs are more easily faked. But obviously, this has been changed with the constitutional amendment. So I did a current status of student voter ID laws. And so it's similar to what I showed you on the red and the green chart going across. And so Tennessee, again, is in the red. We still are not allowing it, and the other states are not. And to wrap up, students decide whether they want to register and vote in their home state or in the state where they attend college. Therefore, despite the arguments articulated for refusing to allow college student IDs to be used for voting purposes, especially by some Tennessee legislatures and all of the other southeastern states contiguous to Tennessee are allowing student IDs to be used for voting purposes. So, in fact, and probably not, particularly for SEC and basketball season going on right now, we might not want to get this out too much, but students living in Tennessee would have fewer restrictions imposed on their right to vote on election day if they attended college in one of these other southeastern states contiguous to Tennessee. Okay, so I'm going to leave it right there. So my last slide basically said Tennessee should allow students to use their college student IDs for voting purposes.
And finally, our third speaker speaker might have figured out a compromise position from both ends. So Professor Mazo, please.
While Sean gets the slides up, thank you for having me. I want to say all of the other speakers were introduced as being educated in Tennessee. I actually lived in Tennessee for a year. My wife was a public interest environmental lawyer at the Southern Environmental Law Center, and we lived in Nashville for a year. So maybe I can be on the panel as well. I'm an election law scholar, and I have written in every area of election law, but I've never written anything about election administration. So I've written about campaign finance, for example. This is a book that I edited that just came out in November. I wish there was a stand out there selling each copy for $90, but that's not happening.
My books are cheaper.
Just get mine from the law review.
I've written about campaign finance. I've written about redistricting. I've written about voting rights, but I had never written about election administration. And partly the editors of the Law Review wanted me to write a little bit in this field. Perhaps they wanted me to be on this panel. And so I came to this debate, though I'm a liberal election law scholar, I came to this debate from an entirely neutral perspective. And what I wanted to do in my article was approach this issue from a neutral perspective. One of the things that worried me about this issue was that it wasn't neutral at all in any way. And Republicans tend to be concerned with election integrity. They claim that voter ID laws are necessary to prevent fraud. And this is just a consistent position, and there's sort of no cracks in that wall. Democrats liken voter ID laws to poll taxes and literacy tests that existed in the past, and they claim these laws disenfranchise minorities, the elderly, the poor. If you look at more articles, they also disenfranchise people by socioeconomic status. They disenfranchise Native Americans. This is what this debate is about. And what I found was that the parties didn't speak a common language. They couldn't speak to each other in any way when it came to voter ID laws. I'll point this out to you in a second. So there's this debate about do we prevent fraud or do we discriminate against people? And what I tried to do was find a neutral ground. I want to take you through a little bit of the history of voter ID laws and how they came to be. It turns out that some states actually had voter ID requirements. In 1950, South Carolina became the first state to require that its voters show a form of identification at the polls when they vote. And the document didn't have to be a photo ID. Rather, any document bearing the voter's name and address would suffice. And in 1970, actually, Hawaii followed, Texas followed in 1971, Florida followed in 1977, Alaska in 1980. Now, in all of these states, at the time, provisions existed that allowed voters to cast a regular ballot even if they didn't bring their ID, or a provisional ballot even if they didn't bring an ID. And as of 2000, only 14 out of our 50 states required an identification for a voter. Now, what changed? What made voter ID laws all of a sudden blossom and bloom in these states? By the way, today, 35 states out of the 50 require some kind of voter ID. Partly, and I think you guys might not disagree, it was the federal government that pushed them in this direction. So in 1993, the federal government passed a law called the National Voter Registration Act. It's commonly and cutely known as the Motor Voter Law. And what happened was it's nicknamed the Motor Voter Law because the law required that states provide a way to vote for all citizens when they walked into a state motor vehicle office and other state agencies, but motor vehicle offices are the most famous of the bunch. So when you walk in to get a driver's license, if you move from Tennessee to Alabama, or if you move from Tennessee to California, and you go get a new license, the state is required to provide you with a voter registration form, either on the state form or on an official form that the Electoral Assistance Commission requires. Now, the motor voter law did a few other things as well. It also required states to accept new voter registration applications by mail. Not all states did that. Now, the federal government, under the Elections Clause, has the right to regulate federal elections. And so this was the requirement for federal elections. All of a sudden, states were required to accept voter registration applications by mail using mail-in forms. The motor voter law did something else as well. It made it very difficult for states to remove voters from their voter registration rolls for not voting. So some states kept voters on the rolls for a long time. Some states removed them if they hadn't voted in so many elections. And the federal government now made it very difficult to do this. The NVRA did a few other things too. It enforced some safeguards. So if voters happened to move within their precinct or move within a state and they had a new address, they were allowed to vote in their new location, again, in federal elections. And as this happens, Congress often regulates how we do federal elections, and the states line up because it's very expensive for them to regulate their state elections in one way, the way they want, and regulate the presidential election in a different way, the way Congress wants. So the states, not wanting to spend twice as much money, sort of grumpily fall in line and do their state elections like they do their federal elections. Now, as of 2000, as I said, only 14 states had voter ID laws. But what happened in 2000 was Bush v. Gore. And election administration all of a sudden was on everybody's agenda. That debacle put election administration on everybody's agenda. And Congress started to believe that people thought that there was I don't know how you would call it, worry among the electorate, or people's confidence in election integrity had been harmed by Bush v. Gore. And so in 2002, Congress passed a law called the Help America Vote Act, or we call it HAVA for short, the Help America Vote Act. It was another federal statute that was aimed at improving the administration of elections. And HAVA imposed, again, various new requirements on the states, including a limited voter ID requirement. Specifically, HAVA mandated that any individual who registered to vote by mail now had to present a valid photo ID before the person could vote, whether in person or by mail. So the person could register by mail and then vote in person or by mail, but an ID card had to be presented at this point. And Congress was very clear that this was a minimal standard and the states could exceed it. Again, in the early 2000s and mid-2000s, there was a lot of activity around election administration. And as Hans mentioned, in 2005, there was a commission convened. It was called the Carter-Baker Commission, named after the former Secretary of State and the former president. And it looked at this issue of voter IDs. And the Carter-Baker Commission recommended that IDs be used for voting. In fact, what the Carter-Baker Commission wanted to do was recommend that there would be a national ID card that would be used for voting throughout. But the expense was very great. And so they sort of pushed back and they recommended that states use real IDs, like your driver's license. There's something called the Real ID Act. And so before you get a driver's license, the state has to get lots of things from you, including your social security number. And they recommended that they add citizenship and so forth. Well, these were the minimal standards that were recommended. And what happened was the states began to enact more restrictive standards on their own. The federal government got the ball rolling. And then the states began to enact more restrictive measures. If you look at this slide, this is not my slide. This slide comes from the National Council of State Legislatures. There are different kinds of voter ID laws. So when we talk about voter ID laws, we tend to think that they're just one monolithic thing. This is how we've been presenting them. But as you heard from Tracey's presentation, they're student voter ID laws. They sort of fall into two major categories. There are, and I'm sorry for the blurriness of the slide. Again, it's not my slide. I literally stole it from somebody else's website. There are voter ID laws that are photo ID laws and non-photo ID laws, right? So there are some states that require you to show a photo, and there are other states that require you not to show a photo, but another type of ID, a copy of a check, a utility statement, and so forth. So some states require photos, some states don't require photos. Another way that we could divide these ID laws is there are strict ID laws, voter ID laws, and there are non-strict voter ID laws. The strict ones require you to have a voter ID, and if you don't have one, you can't vote. The non-strict ones, even if you don't come with an ID, there's a safety net at the end, so you can vote with a provisional ballot. If you then walk back to the Division of Elections or your county clerk's office, and within 7 days of the election, you actually prove that you are who you are, then they count your ballot. And so what you can see happening is you can see those lines dividing the universe into strict and non-strict, photo and non-photo. And as you can see, more and more states, this goes from 2000 to 2016, again, not my slide, or it is my slide, but not my graph. You can see that more and more states are enacting voter ID laws, and as I told you, today, as if there's writing, 35 states have them. So that is some background, and just some information that voter ID laws are more complicated than they are. They're not just all monolithic. Hans mentioned their popular support, and I did some research on this as well, and this is fairly interesting. Overwhelmingly, in the United States, overwhelmingly, among the electorate, voter ID laws have a majority support of most Americans. In a 2008 study that appeared in the Election Law Journal by Thad Hall, Inez Levin, Charles Stewart, and Michael Alvarez, political scientists from Caltech and MIT. They surveyed 10,000 voters registered in all 50 states during the 2008 presidential election. They found that 75.6% of them supported requiring citizens to show a photo ID when they voted. In fact, showing a photo ID is the only reform in election administration that the majority of Americans support, over and over and over. They surveyed all 50 states. The state with the lowest support was Massachusetts. 60.9% of citizens in Massachusetts support having a voter ID. The highest states were Hawaii and Indiana. 88.3% of people in Hawaii and 84.8% of people in Indiana supported voters having a photo ID. In 2012, these surveys were done again, this time by the Washington Post. In 2012, 74% of respondents said they favored voters showing a voter ID. In 2016, Gallup did the same poll or a similar poll. In 2016, 80% of respondents showed that they said that they wanted voters to have a voter ID. Now, before you jump to conclusions and say, oh, all Americans want voter IDs, I want to tell you that actually nuances appear within these surveys. So, for example, when we break down the numbers by race or when we break down the numbers by political affiliation, we get slightly different results. For example, let's break them down by political affiliation. 95% of Republicans, 95% of Republicans. In 2016, Gallup found preferred a voter ID to not a voter ID. However, the number dropped to 63% for Democrats. And it was 83% for voters that were unaffiliated or are independents. It's also not exactly clear why voters support this voter ID requirement overwhelmingly. The surveys themselves don't have any nuance. The surveys themselves don't really ask, do you prefer any voter ID or just a photo ID? They don't educate their respondents on the differences between these different types of laws. Most of the surveys don't ask nuanced questions. For example, a follow-up question of survey respondents, which asks, what do you care about more, preventing voter fraud or not disenfranchising people from voting? There, about 48% say they care about preventing voter fraud. About 44% say they care about not disenfranchising voters more. So you can see there's nuances to these things. Now, justifications for voter IDs. If I can go on for 2 minutes beyond that. Okay. Justifications for voter ID. To prevent voter fraud is the justification that we're always given. To prevent voter fraud. But what I can tell you is that voter fraud is not a uniform monolith category. There are different types of voter fraud. So, for example, there is in-person voter fraud, when somebody walks into a booth and impersonates somebody else. There's also absentee ballot fraud. So Hans told you about a situation in North Carolina where fraud was committed during an election. But that wasn't in-person voter fraud. That was ballot harvesting. That was somebody collecting absentee ballots and doing something with those absentee ballots. And voter ID laws don't prevent that type of harm. The harm they prevent is in-person voter fraud when somebody substitutes and votes for somebody else. Okay? So voter fraud isn't a monolithic thing. Another reason we have voter ID laws is to prevent the appearance of fraud. So if people think voter fraud is happening, but voter fraud really isn't happening, that makes people have less confidence in their democracy, and that's another reason that we have voter ID laws. Another reason out there is that other countries have voter ID laws. It turns out over 100 other countries have voter ID laws. Now, Hans told you that the United States is the only first world democracy that doesn't have voter ID laws. By the way, that's a false statement. Britain doesn't have voter ID laws. Australia doesn't have voter ID laws. New Zealand doesn't have voter ID laws, but most of them do. Let me tell you a little bit about litigation concerning voter ID laws. We can talk about this in the panel, but most of these laws have been challenged either on 14th Amendment grounds or on 24th Amendment grounds, in other words, as a poll tax, or under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, or under state constitutional law. Voter ID laws have only come to the United States once, in 2008, in a case called Crawford versus Marion County Election Board. It was a case out of Indiana. Hans told you that Justice Stevens wrote the opinion. What he neglected to tell you is that Justice Stevens and Justice Posner, who listened to that case in the Seventh Circuit, have since publicly recanted. And have since publicly and in their published writings said, you know what, we made a mistake in this case. Now, I don't know if they made a mistake or not. I'm just telling you, you could have mentioned that. They recanted and they said, we didn't have enough evidence to decide. And so it's only appeared once in the Supreme Court. Just to wrap this up. The effects. Let me tell you about the effects of these laws. The effects of these laws are totally unclear. They're totally unclear, and we get a mixed picture. When we look at states that had voter ID laws and that didn't have voter ID laws, implemented the voter ID laws, and then what happens in the next election, we get totally different ideas. Now, the ACLU and the Brennan Center say that 21 million Americans, or about 11% of the people, don't have a voter ID. The Government Accountability Office looked at voting in Kansas, Tennessee, and in a different study, not the Government Accountability Office, looked at voting in Indiana before and after voter ID laws. Those studies said that voter turnout dropped once the voter ID laws were implemented. However, in Georgia, between 2006 and 2010, in other words, once Georgia had a voter ID requirement in 2007, voting by African Americans rose 44%. Voting by Hispanics rose 67%. And voting by whites rose as well, but only by 12%. So depending on which study you look at, you get a different result. And the studies are unclear. One theory is psychology. In other words, people implement a voter ID, and then Democratic groups get very upset, and they mobilize voters. And then they vote in higher numbers in the next election. Now, Obama was on the ballot in 2008, and maybe that explains higher voting in Georgia by African Americans, but he certainly wasn't on the ballot in 2006 and 2010. Now, at the aggregate level, recent studies have shown that there's no effect of voter ID laws. Now, Hans told you about a recent NBR study that came out just a month ago. This was a study that did a difference in difference equation. It looked at 3 billion votes cast, and it said that there is no effect at all of voter ID laws on the aggregate level in the United States, not in any particular state. What he neglected to tell you is that the exact same study said there's actually no effect on decreasing voter fraud at all either on the aggregate level. It's the same exact study. It's not my study, it's not his study, it's just a study that was published out there. So we don't know what the effect of these laws is. Just to wrap up, and we can talk about this. I actually have a solution that I propose, but let me just end there. These laws, the effect is really unclear. I do have a solution. I'll just leave it for the. I don't want to take the time. I'll leave it for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're running a little bit late, but I do want to leave a couple of minutes for questions, either from panelists to each other, or hopefully from the audience to the panel members. So if anyone has a question, please.
I do, and it was glossed over, but it wasn't, I don't think, specifically addressed. Tennessee's voter ID laws requires an in-state issued identification. And I know the gentleman from the Heritage Foundation said that he hasn't seen any instances of anyone being turned away. I actually personally have. They brought their birth certificate, proof of residency. They had in fact registered to vote, but they were turned away because they had a Georgia ID because they'd only been in the state for 4 months. And he had mentioned that you can buy a beer, you can get married, you can do all those things with an out-of-state ID, but you can't vote. And I was wondering, does anyone have any thoughts on whether or not that violates the full faith and credit provisions of not recognizing out-of-state identifications for purposes of voting?
Well, I would answer that by saying that, first of all, I don't know what the law is in Tennessee, but most states have a law saying that when you move here, you have to exchange your driver's license within a certain amount of time. And one of the reasons for not only requiring in-state driver's licenses is illustrated by a specific example from Indiana. Okay, when the Indiana case was up before the U.S. Supreme Court, the ACLU filed a brief, and they named a specific woman in Indiana as an example of someone who'd been unable to vote. So a local newspaper went and interviewed this woman to find out what her problem had been. Well, it turned out when she got to the polling place, she pulled out a Florida driver's license to try to vote. Upon investigation, the newspaper discovered that not only did she have a Florida driver's license, but she was also registered to vote in Florida and had claimed a homestead exemption in Florida, which requires you to declare you're a resident of the state. So my point there is that kind of requirement actually, in this case, detected somebody who was illegally registered in more than one state. Could I address just a couple of things that Dr. Mazo said? First of all, he said that voter ID doesn't do anything about absentee ballot fraud. Well, that's incorrect in states that have extended the voter ID requirement to absentee ballots. And there's 4 states that have done that, including Alabama, Kansas, Wisconsin, and others, and that's a recommendation I make to all states. Just limiting it to in-person voting is a bad idea. The GAO study that he mentions, I actually wrote an article pointing out the analytical flaws in that study and the mistakes that GAO made, including not getting official data, turnout data from those states, instead going to a firm called Catalyst to get their data, but they made some very basic errors there. And as for the latest study saying that voter ID doesn't prevent voter fraud, well, it's pretty hard to prove a negative. And in fact, I just wrote an article showing the problem with that. It's really hard to detect, for example, impersonation fraud at the polls if you don't have an ID in place to do that.
Two quick things. One, just back to this absentee and voter ID issue. Requiring voter ID would not have stopped the North Carolina situation where it was someone collecting ballots, however they were filled out, and just not sending them on. So, including the photo ID requirement.
Well, I'll be happy to answer that. And the answer to that is no, it can't prevent all kinds of absentee ballot fraud, but it can make absentee ballot fraud harder to commit, and I'll give you a specific example of that. In the 1990s, the Justice Department had one of its largest prosecutions in Alabama, in a county called Greene County. There was a massive absentee ballot fraud case there going on, and it was not inter-party. It was not one party stealing from another. It was incumbent Democratic candidates stealing the election from African American Democratic challengers, and they were forging absentee ballots for voters and doing other things to manipulate the ballots. And in fact, the African American candidate who complained to the FBI, whose election was stolen and got this going, one of the things he said was that if Alabama had had an ID requirement in place so that the individuals forging these ballots had to also send either a photocopy of the person's photo ID, a driver's license, or the serial number from the driver's license, this kind of fraud could not have happened in that case.
Well, sadly, we're going to have to break, but I'm inviting the panel members to stay here, and if you have...
You don't want the solution?
Yeah. 30 seconds for the solution?
All right, folks, the real issue here is registration. We make it very difficult to vote in this country because we make voters register. And registration votes, a percentage of people registered by white, black, income, by ethnic group, all of this data exists. What states should actually do, if you're really in favor of voter ID, is tie it to registration. When a person turns 18, you automatically register to vote. You give them a voter ID at the exact same time. That way, no one is disenfranchised and everybody's registered to vote. And instead of states paying millions of dollars to litigate these cases, they should pay that money out to register more voters. So that they should take voter ID and use it to broaden the electorate and to broaden the franchise and make democracy both safe and greater for everybody. That's the solution. It's how we